Thank you very much for being here with us today, Dr. Melody, and we look forward to your presentation.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me. And thank you for the introduction. What I'd like to do is really briefly introduce myself so you can have a sense of where I'm coming from. Physically, literally, I'm calling in from the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Lands on Laurier's campus in Waterloo. I'll skip over the bicultural heritage, not bringing it, except to say, like, sometimes when people look at me, they think I might be First Nations or Inuit, but I'm not, though I do a lot of work with mostly First Nations communities across Canada. A lot of the sort of work that I do, and including the work that I'm going to share with you, is informed by working in different areas, including in community development, mediation, conflict resolution, and sort of restorative justice approaches before coming into academic research. And my interest in working with Indigenous communities, or my existing relationships, are long-term. And it started primarily working with communities that are tied to my youngest child, who is First Nations. And so I am not necessarily seen as a fly-by-night researcher. I have other obligations and commitments and lifelong ties to communities that hold me accountable for the work that I do. And almost all of the Indigenous projects that I'm involved with are by invitation, including the research that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And so the context behind this, really briefly, is West Moberly First Nations is First Nations in BC in the Peace River Valley, and they have been fighting for a long time to not have the Site C dam built, and they requested that I do some research. And one of the pieces was to do a systematic review of what other Indigenous communities across the world have experienced in terms of mental health impacts from a variety of different resource extractive type industries. And it's not that the community necessarily would be surprised by the findings, but I think a big part of why they asked this is so that the language of the systematic review coming from a researcher lens and having it published in a public domain carries more value than their own voices, unfortunately. So I will be sharing the findings from a systematic review with you today. So the overarching question that we were trying to answer with the review was, what are the anticipated mental health impacts? There was another component of the research that was looking at the existing mental health impacts locally on the community, but that's not for sharing externally. And we included in the review not just dams, even though that was their own personal interest, but we included mining, petroleum, and agriculture with the intent to see if they were similar, there are nuanced differences between them, but also to know that in all of those, it does impact land access, use, and just sometimes relocating, but I'll talk about another phenomenon that people had written about. And in the systematic review, we looked at papers that were reporting on Indigenous communities in these areas. So North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and some circumpolar regions. We only looked at papers that were reporting on mental health risks or protective factors. And we were really interested in the experiences, outcomes, and impacts that were reported. And we were only limiting it to papers that were talking about access to land in relation to dams, mining, petroleum, and agriculture. We didn't limit it to published works only. We also looked at books and reports that we could find. So it was a pretty exhaustive search. And just to give you a sense of what we found in that review, this is not to say that this is an accurate picture of what's actually happening. It's just a picture of studies that were reported in the systematic review that met those criteria. And note that all of us, or collectively, none of us were fluent enough in other languages that there very well could be very important papers that we would have loved to have included if we could speak other languages. But you'll see that the majority of papers that we found in English were coming out of the Canadian context. And within all of the papers, I'll just give you a moment to look at the map. You can see not only by country, but by the industry. And after going through thousands of abstracts and titles, and then eventually a bunch of full texts, there were 29 studies that were included in the analysis. So what I'm going to share you is based on those 29 studies. The reason there's 31 papers is because sometimes people write about studies in more than one paper. So together, there were 29 studies. This is a figure that I think sums up the relationships and some of the key findings from the papers, and having listened in on part of the morning presenters, but also Dr. Davison, I feel like perhaps many of the people on this call are not surprised by the kinds of things that are shown in this figure. I am going to advance to the next slide, but I'm just going to start honing in on certain parts of the figure. So the figure will not disappear from your view. So I want to draw attention to the left-hand part of the figure. The green circle represents the context before there was industrial development. So there's an inherent sort of baseline understanding that land and wellness of Indigenous peoples are completely enmeshed. And it isn't until there was land dispossession from development and colonial influences that interrupted the overall wellness of individuals, families, and communities. And all of like what sort of makes communities and families be well is very much tied into the ability to be proud and be able to practice your own cultural language and other practices on the land, and be able to have autonomy and self-determination. And so once there was interruption in the way of life, we sort of distinguish between the impacts, the direct impacts from no longer being able to access land or their land, as well as the impacts that come from the industries themselves. So just to highlight here, so when land is dispossessed, we're talking about when land is permanently or temporarily unavailable, or people literally have to relocate. There is I think I'm going to talk about in a later slide, but sometimes communities are having to relocate, and other times not so much relocate, but adapt and live in areas that become more contaminated. And by land, we were not limiting ourselves to what I think are Western-oriented ways of thinking of land, but including water, air, ice, and all things that live in and on the land. And so the impacts of not being able to live on or access land that was a very core part of their way of life led to the loss of being able to safely be able to hunt and gather food, as well as do things that are important for a sense of purpose and livelihood. So food insecurity became a featured theme, and also people's ability to connect spiritually through access to land, including burial sites that sometimes are flooded or just dug up. And when we're talking about industrial activities, I think this was already talked about quite a bit in other presentations, but of course there's an influx of people who are not part of the Indigenous community to start with. Changes in jobs, wages, the infrastructure, all those things, but then it leads to a lot of the things that Dr. Davison was just highlighting in terms of disparities, like differences in income levels, access to jobs, access to different types of things. It also increases the cost of living and the introduction of certain types of substances that can lead to a whole lot of other outcomes, which I will speak to in the next slide. So because the requested research was really focused around mental health, we have mental health here in the center, but to highlight that the loss of access to land, but also the impacts from the industries had social impacts, which are very much what was just presented by Dr. Davison. But also there were direct impacts on people's mental health, but sometimes the mental health would lead to some of the things that are listed here in the social impacts. So they're kind of a cyclical challenge where mental health over time is impacted over many generations. So just to say, these are all quite interconnected and not necessarily in a linear sort of pathway per se. And to highlight some of the things that we read in the papers, it was challenging because a lot of systematic reviews are written by researchers who are not members of the Indigenous community that is being shared about in the paper. So we really wanted to highlight the first person voice of people in those systematic reviews. So I'm just going to highlight 3 here. The first one was from a member about an oil spill on the western side of Canada, where they say, I think it's sad. You desperately want to connect with something that your people have connected to since the beginning of time. I call it blood memory. We have a reciprocal relationship, and referring to water, as a living being. It goes against our spiritual relationship with Mother Earth. And someone else was talking about a mining project in Australia said, they are digging up the backbone of Yolngu, which is the name of the people of that area. And in the US, about a dam said, we came up on top, but we left everything in the bottom. And one of the interesting things was when we submitted the paper, one of the reviewers was challenged. They didn't like having the first person voices in the paper and were concerned that the mental health reportings within the papers were not backed up by diagnostic assessments that had been done by professional people that do assessments on mental health conditions. But in reality, I think people on this call might appreciate this, but a lot of these communities wouldn't have access to people that would make those assessments, but the people that make those assessments are not trained and necessarily I don't know what the right word to say is, but might not be accurately able to assess what's going on. Anyway, long story short, there is a gross there isn't very much research done on the mental health and well-being impacts from different industries, but from what there is, one thing is clear that a lot of Indigenous communities across the world globally consider themselves very much, their health and wellness is very much tied in with the land. And if we think about the determinants of health for Indigenous peoples, it's very fundamental and core. It would be sort of very essential that people have access to the land if that is still possible, but we know that a lot of Indigenous peoples over time have had to migrate into more urban centers, so that becomes more difficult. And I wanted to highlight that this piece of research was really more about making sure that the findings reach a particular audience. I don't think communities that have experienced going through industrial development would be surprised by any of the findings, and that there is hope in places where Indigenous communities and nations have free, prior, and informed consent, which I think some people are talking about today, and that's where I think we might begin to see more change. I think that's it for me.